There is a moment that feels almost unreal, the moment you see them again after a long period of no contact. You may have imagined it many times in your mind. Maybe you wondered if they would ignore you, if they would act cold, or if they would suddenly realize everything they lost. But when the moment actually happens, something deeper takes place beneath the surface. Something instant, something instinctive. Because when an avoidant sees you again after no contact, their mind doesn't stay neutral. Their emotions don't stay quiet. In fact, in that exact second, their entire internal world begins reacting faster than they can control. Even if their face looks calm, even if their words sound distant, something powerful is happening internally, and most people never realize it. No contact creates a kind of silence that avoidants are not used to. During the relationship, they often relied on distance to manage their emotions. When things became intense, they would pull away. When feelings got overwhelming, they would create space. But no contact flips that dynamic completely. Suddenly, the space is no longer their choice. The silence is no longer under their control. And while it may look like they moved on easily, the truth is much more complicated. Avoidants don't process emotions in the same way most people do. Instead of confronting feelings directly, they tend to suppress them, push them aside, or distract themselves. But suppression is not the same as healing. When emotions are pushed down instead of processed, they don't disappear. They stay hidden, quietly waiting beneath the surface. That is why seeing you again can trigger something immediate. Because the moment their eyes land on you, all of those suppressed emotions that were carefully tucked away suddenly rise back up. It's almost like their mind recognizes something before they even have time to think about it. A memory, a feeling, a connection they once tried to escape. For a brief moment, their emotional defenses are caught off guard. They weren't expecting this rush of familiarity. They weren't prepared for how quickly the past could come flooding back. And even if they try to act normal, even if they try to appear unaffected, inside there is a rapid emotional calculation happening. You might think that by the time you see them again, they are completely over you. After all, avoidants are known for moving forward quickly on the surface. They may seem busy with life, surrounded by new experiences, maybe even new people. But what many don't understand is that avoidants rarely process emotional loss in real time. Instead, they delay it. While others go through heartbreak openly, avoidants often postpone that emotional confrontation for later, sometimes much later, and the absence created by no contact forces them into a strange emotional space they can't fully control. Because when you disappear from their life, something shifts in their mind. The dynamic changes. The familiarity they once took for granted is suddenly gone. At first, they might convince themselves that the distance is good, that things are easier this way, that independence feels safer. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. Without constant interaction, the negative memories that once justified their emotional distance slowly start fading. The arguments become less vivid. The pressure they once felt becomes less intense, and what often remains are the moments that felt peaceful, meaningful, or genuine. This shift happens quietly in the background of their mind. They rarely talk about it. They rarely admit it. But the absence you created begins reshaping how they remember the connection. So when they finally see you again after that period of silence, the encounter hits differently than most people expect. It's not just a casual meeting between two people who once knew each other. For them, it feels like their internal narrative is suddenly being challenged, because the person they spent months distancing themselves from is now standing right in front of them again. Real, present, unavoidable. And in that instant, something inside them starts reacting before logic even has time to catch up. The first thing they notice often isn't what you say. It isn't even what you do. It's the energy you carry. Avoidants are incredibly sensitive to emotional pressure, but they are also surprisingly aware of emotional shifts. When someone who once chased them suddenly appears calm, grounded, and emotionally centered, it disrupts the expectations they built during the separation. They were used to a certain dynamic. Maybe they expected tension. Maybe they expected awkwardness. Maybe they expected you to still be emotionally tied to them in the same way you were before. But when they see a version of you that feels different, their mind immediately starts paying attention. It might show in a quick glance, a moment where their eyes linger just a little longer than expected. Sometimes it appears as a slight hesitation in their body language, like their mind is trying to process something unexpected. Because deep down, avoidants often assume that people remain emotionally attached to them even after distance. They expect the familiar pattern to continue, but when they see you standing there with a quiet confidence that wasn't present before, it sends a signal they can't easily ignore. Something has changed. And that realization alone begins triggering a wave of curiosity inside them. Curiosity is a powerful emotion for avoidants because it allows them to stay emotionally engaged without feeling trapped. When they start wondering about you again, their attention naturally shifts back toward the connection they once tried to leave behind. They might not say it directly, but internally they begin asking questions. What happened during the time apart? Why do you seem different? Did you move on emotionally? Did someone else take their place? These questions rarely come out immediately through words, but you can often see them in subtle behaviors. A longer glance, a quiet observation, a small pause before speaking. Another thing many people don't realize is how much avoidants rely on non-verbal signals to read emotional situations. While they struggle with openly expressing vulnerability, they are extremely attentive to body language and emotional tone. When they see you again after no contact, their eyes often become their primary source of information. They study your expressions, your posture, the way you carry yourself, not because they are consciously analyzing every detail, but because their mind is trying to understand whether the emotional dynamic has shifted. And sometimes their eyes reveal more than they intend. Even when their words are short or distant, there can be flashes of something deeper behind their gaze. Recognition, nostalgia, even a hint of surprise. Because for a brief moment, they are seeing someone who was once a significant emotional presence in their life. And despite everything that happened, that familiarity doesn't disappear instantly. Emotional bonds don't erase themselves simply because distance was created. They remain stored in memory, waiting for something to activate them again. This is why eye contact during that first encounter can feel strangely intense. Even if the conversation is brief, even if both of you try to keep things casual, there is often an unspoken layer of communication happening beneath the surface. The mind remembers more than the heart wants to admit. And avoidants, despite their tendency to suppress emotions, are not immune to that experience. In fact, sometimes it affects them even more strongly because those feelings were never fully processed in the first place. But here is where the situation becomes even more interesting. While all of this emotional activity is happening internally, avoidants often respond externally in ways that seem completely opposite. Instead of appearing emotional, they may suddenly become quiet or reserved. Instead of expressing warmth, they may act neutral or even slightly distant. For many people, this reaction feels confusing or even hurtful. But what most don't realize is that this behavior is often an automatic defense mechanism. When avoidants feel emotions rising too quickly, their instinct is to regain control by creating emotional distance. So the very moment when they might be feeling the strongest internal reaction is often the same moment when they appear the most guarded on the outside. It's not necessarily because they don't care. In many cases, it's because the situation is activating emotions they are not fully comfortable facing. Their mind is trying to stabilize itself, trying to prevent vulnerability from taking over too quickly. And that is the hidden reality of seeing an avoidant after no contact. The instant their eyes meet yours, something inside them reacts, memories reappear, curiosity awakens, emotional defenses activate. Their mind begins processing questions they weren't expecting to ask again. All of it happens in seconds, faster than most people realize, and while they may not say a word about what they feel in that moment, the internal shift is very real. Because the truth is, no contact doesn't just create distance, it creates reflection. And when an avoidant finally sees you again after that silence, the reflection they tried to ignore suddenly becomes impossible to avoid. And this is where something unexpected often happens. The moment they realize that you are not reacting the way you used to, In the past, they may have been used to seeing you emotionally affected by their distance. Maybe they expected to see longing in your eyes, hesitation in your voice, or that familiar pull that showed you were still deeply tied to them. But when they see you calm, when they sense that quiet confidence in your presence, it can genuinely shock them. Because for a long time the dynamic between you followed a certain pattern. When they pulled away, you may have tried to understand them. You may have reached out, tried to communicate, tried to close the emotional gap they created. That effort, that energy, became something they subconsciously expected. Even if they never admitted it, a part of them assumed it would always be there. But no contact changed that pattern completely. Now you are standing there without that same urgency. Your energy is different. Your presence feels more grounded. And avoidants are extremely sensitive to emotional pressure, but they are equally sensitive to emotional absence. When the pressure they once felt from the relationship is suddenly gone, their mind struggles to understand the shift. For a moment it disrupts the narrative they built in their head about how things would be between you. They may have convinced themselves that you would always care more, that you would always be the one waiting. But when they see someone who seems peaceful without them, something inside them pauses, because the role they subconsciously expected you to play is no longer visible. This moment can create a strange kind of emotional silence between both of you. Not necessarily awkward, but charged with unspoken awareness. They are observing you carefully, even if they try to appear casual. Their mind is quietly comparing the person standing in front of them now to the person they remember from before. And that comparison begins triggering something deeper inside them, because when avoidants sense that someone they once held emotional power over has emotionally stabilized without them, it awakens a new form of respect that wasn't necessarily present during the relationship. When someone is always available, always pursuing, always trying to fix the connection, avoidants can sometimes take that emotional presence for granted, not intentionally, but because their mind is wired to seek space when intimacy becomes too intense. But when that pursuit disappears, when you stop chasing, stop convincing, stop trying to force closeness, something shifts in how they perceive you. They begin to see strength where they once saw emotional attachment, and that realization can create a quiet tension inside them, because now their mind is facing a question it didn't expect to confront. What if you actually moved on? This is where the silent emotional calculation begins. Even if they don't show it, their mind starts rapidly analyzing the situation. They look for clues in your behavior. They listen carefully to the tone of your voice. They watch how relaxed you seem. They are trying to figure out whether the connection that once existed still has any place in your life. Did you heal from the breakup? Did someone else come into your life? Do you still feel anything when you see them? Avoidants may not ask these questions directly, but internally they become extremely curious about the answers. Curiosity is safer for them than vulnerability. Instead of openly expressing emotions, they gather information, they observe, they try to understand the emotional landscape without stepping too far into it. And sometimes this is exactly when they start acting colder than expected. Many people misunderstand this reaction. When someone finally meets an avoidant after no contact, they often hope for warmth, acknowledgement, or some kind of emotional openness, but instead the avoidant may suddenly appear distant, reserved, or even slightly detached. It can feel confusing, almost as if the connection meant nothing to them, but the truth behind that reaction is often the opposite. When avoidants feel emotionally overwhelmed, their instinct is to create distance quickly so they can regain a sense of control. Seeing you again may have triggered memories they weren't prepared to feel. It may have awakened emotions they thought were already buried, and when that emotional intensity rises too fast, their defense system activates automatically. So instead of showing vulnerability, they retreat into composure. Their voice may become neutral, their expressions may appear calm, their words may remain simple and controlled. But inside, there is often far more happening than their behavior reveals, because seeing you again after no contact forces them to face something they avoided during the separation. The reality that the connection you once shared was real, and the possibility that it might not be as replaceable as they once believed. For a brief moment, something like internal panic can surface. Not dramatic panic, but a subtle emotional discomfort that spreads through their thoughts. It's the realization that things have changed in ways they cannot fully control anymore. During the relationship, when emotions became overwhelming, they had the ability to step back. They could create space, reduce communication, or shift their attention elsewhere. But now the situation feels different. You already stepped away. You already created the distance. And when they see you again standing there peacefully within your own life, they begin to understand something important. You are no longer orbiting around them. That awareness can be deeply unsettling for someone who unconsciously relied on emotional distance to maintain control in the relationship, because suddenly they are the one experiencing uncertainty, and uncertainty naturally leads to curiosity. At this stage, many avoidants begin observing you with a quiet fascination. They want to understand what happened during the time apart, not necessarily because they are ready to reconnect immediately, but because your transformation challenges the assumptions they carried for months. They might start asking subtle questions. Nothing too direct at first. Maybe they ask how you have been. Maybe they casually ask about work, life, or recent experiences. On the surface, these questions sound simple, but beneath them lies something more personal. They are trying to measure the emotional distance between you now. They want to see whether the connection still exists beneath the surface. Sometimes they don't even need words to feel that curiosity growing. They might simply watch how you interact with the world around you, how you speak, how you carry yourself, whether you seem emotionally affected by their presence or completely comfortable in the moment. And when they sense that you are genuinely at peace, something shifts again inside them. Because the version of you standing there now feels unfamiliar in the most intriguing way. The emotional energy they once associated with the relationship is no longer dominating your presence. Instead of intensity, there is balance. Instead of longing, there is quiet self-assurance. That transformation creates a powerful psychological effect. People naturally become curious about what they can no longer easily predict. And avoidants, despite their reputation for emotional distance, are no exception. Once curiosity begins growing, their attention slowly gravitates back toward you. They may not admit it openly, but internally they start noticing small details again. The way you smile, the way you speak, the subtle comfort in your energy. These small observations can trigger memories they thought were already resolved. Memories of conversations that once felt meaningful. Moments of laughter that once felt effortless. Times when the connection between you felt safe, even for them. The mind has a strange way of revisiting emotional memories when a familiar person suddenly reappears in a new form, and avoidants often experience this quietly, internally, without fully expressing it. From the outside, the interaction may look simple, just two people talking again after time apart. But internally, the avoidant is experiencing layers of emotional processing they weren't expecting to revisit. And here is something important many people overlook. When someone who once chased an avoidant stops chasing and begins living confidently within their own emotional world, it creates a powerful shift in perception. What once felt overwhelming now feels intriguing. What once felt like pressure now feels like independence. And independence is something avoidants deeply respect. They may not say it out loud. They may not immediately act on it. But when they see someone who has grown stronger instead of remaining emotionally stuck, it changes how they see the entire connection. The person they once distanced themselves from suddenly feels different, more mysterious, more grounded, more valuable than they previously realized. And that realization is often the beginning of a quiet emotional turning point, because the moment curiosity replaces certainty, the avoidance mind begins reopening doors it once closed. Doors connected to the memories of you, doors connected to the emotions they tried to silence, doors connected to the possibility that the story between you may not be completely finished after all. And the most interesting part is that this shift rarely happens with dramatic words or obvious confessions. It happens silently, internally, inside the space of their own thoughts, all triggered by something incredibly simple: seeing you again after no contact. and realizing that you are no longer the same person they left behind. And once that quiet curiosity begins growing inside them, the small signs start appearing, the ones most people overlook. Avoidants are not always expressive with their emotions, but they rarely become completely indifferent either. When someone once held meaning in their life, that connection tends to leave subtle fingerprints on their behavior. The challenge is that these signs don't always look the way people expect them to. Sometimes it shows up in the way their attention keeps drifting back toward you, even if the conversation has moved on to something else. You might notice their eyes searching your face for a second longer than necessary, almost like they're trying to read something between your expressions. It might appear as a quiet pause before they respond to something you say, as if your words carry more weight than they are ready to admit. These moments are small, almost invisible to anyone outside the interaction, but they often reveal something important. Emotional attachment doesn't disappear simply because time has passed. Avoidants tend to protect themselves by limiting how much emotion they reveal externally, but their internal reactions can still surface through tiny, unconscious behaviors. Maybe their voice softens slightly when they speak to you. Maybe they laugh a little more naturally than they expected to. Sometimes they even mirror your body language without realizing it, leaning in slightly when the conversation feels comfortable. These are not dramatic gestures. They are quiet signals that somewhere beneath the protective layers they built, the connection they once shared with you is still alive in memory. And what makes this moment even more powerful is the energy you now carry. No contact has a way of transforming people. When you step away from a relationship that once consumed your emotional focus, something inside you begins to shift. The space you created becomes a place for reflection, healing, and growth. Slowly, the intensity that once revolved around the connection begins to settle. Your life expands beyond the relationship. Your identity becomes larger than the role you once played within it. When you see them again after this transformation, your presence feels different. Even if you don't consciously try to show it, the energy surrounding you has changed. Avoidants are extremely sensitive to emotional pressure, but they are also deeply aware of emotional freedom. When they sense that you are no longer emotionally dependent on their presence, something inside them reacts immediately. Because the version of you standing there now feels lighter, more self-contained, more emotionally stable. And for someone who once felt overwhelmed by the intensity of closeness, this shift can feel incredibly intriguing. Your calmness removes the pressure that once triggered their instinct to run. Your independence shows them that the connection was never about control or neediness. It shows them that what you offered was genuine care, not emotional confinement. And this realization often creates something unexpected inside them: respect. Respect grows in the quiet space where desperation once lived. When someone stops trying to force closeness and begins standing comfortably within their own emotional world, they become harder to ignore. The energy becomes balanced instead of chasing. For an avoidant, that balance changes everything, because now the connection feels less threatening and more intriguing. Instead of feeling like they need to escape emotional intensity, they begin wondering what it would feel like to approach the connection again under these new circumstances. And with that curiosity often comes something they rarely talk about: regret. Regret for avoidance rarely appears dramatically. It doesn't usually come in the form of emotional speeches or sudden confessions. Instead, it emerges slowly and quietly inside their thoughts. Seeing you again can trigger a series of reflections they may have avoided during the separation. They might start remembering moments when you were patient with them, times when you tried to understand their emotional walls instead of judging them, moments when the connection felt peaceful, safe, and meaningful before fear created distance. The human mind has a natural tendency to soften memories over time. The arguments that once felt overwhelming begin fading into the background, while the meaningful moments become clearer. And when those memories resurface while you are standing right in front of them, the emotional weight of those memories can become surprisingly powerful. They may begin realizing something they didn't fully understand before, that the connection they once stepped away from was actually rare, that not everyone shows the kind of patience, depth, or emotional presence you once offered. But regret is complicated for avoidance. Instead of openly expressing it, they often process it internally. They might not say the words, "I miss what we had." They might not directly acknowledge that they handled the relationship poorly, but inside their mind, the awareness begins forming. What if they walked away from something meaningful? What if fear made them distance themselves from a connection that could have grown into something deeper? These questions don't always lead to immediate action. Avoidants tend to move slowly when emotions become complicated, but the presence of regret often shifts their attention back toward you in subtle ways. And that shift can eventually lead to something many people never expect. They begin trying to restart conversation. It might start with something simple, a casual question about your life, a comment about something familiar between you, a memory they bring up unexpectedly. At first it may seem small, almost insignificant, but for someone who once created emotional distance, choosing to engage again can actually require a surprising amount of internal courage. Avoidants often fear emotional vulnerability because it makes them feel exposed. Reopening communication means stepping back into a space where emotions might resurface. It means risking the possibility of feeling something again. But curiosity and regret together can become powerful motivators. If their internal reflections convince them that the connection was meaningful, they may begin testing the emotional waters slowly. They might start conversations that feel casual but slightly longer than necessary. They may ask more questions than expected. They might even appear more attentive to your responses than before. From the outside, it may look like simple friendliness, but internally something deeper is happening. They are trying to understand whether the emotional door between you is still open, whether the connection they once left behind still has space to exist again in some form. And this is where many people feel something familiar returning: the push and pull dynamic. Avoidants often struggle with the balance between closeness and independence. When they start feeling drawn towards someone emotionally, their instinct can shift back and forth between curiosity and caution. One moment they may seem engaged, interested, even warm. The next moment, they may suddenly appear distant again. This pattern isn't always intentional. It happens because their emotional system is trying to regulate the intensity of the connection. When closeness begins increasing too quickly, their instinct may tell them to slow things down. But something important has already changed. Before no contact, the push and pull dynamic often left you feeling powerless. You may have felt like you were constantly trying to keep the connection alive while they decided how close they wanted to be. Now the energy feels different. You are no longer chasing. You are no longer trying to prove your value or convince them to stay. And that shift quietly changes the entire emotional dynamic between you. Because now they are the one experiencing uncertainty. They are the one wondering how much space they still have in your life. They are the one quietly observing whether the connection can still exist. And beneath all of this emotional movement lies something deeper that avoidants rarely admit out loud. Fear, not the fear of closeness itself, but the fear of losing something meaningful without realizing its value until it was already gone. Seeing you again after no contact can awaken that fear in subtle ways. They might start wondering whether you truly moved on, whether someone else now occupies the emotional space they once had, whether the opportunity to rebuild the connection has already passed. This fear doesn't always show in their behavior immediately. Avoidants are skilled at hiding emotional discomfort, but internally it can create a powerful sense of urgency, because for the first time they may be facing the possibility that the connection they once controlled through distance is no longer theirs to return to whenever they choose. And that realization can change how they see you completely. You are no longer just someone from their past. You become someone whose presence now carries possibility, but also uncertainty. Someone who may still share a connection with them, or someone who may already be moving forward into a life where they no longer play the same role. And sometimes that realization becomes the exact moment when they begin wondering whether they should take another step closer before the chance disappears completely. And once they sense that possibility, a subtle shift begins to take place. The dynamic that once left you feeling powerless or uncertain has quietly reversed. The connection is no longer entirely within their control, and that realization can awaken a mix of emotions they rarely allow themselves to feel fully. It's as if the tables have turned without a word being spoken, without a conscious effort on either side. They start noticing things they hadn't paid attention to before, the way your confidence radiates, how your presence is calm and unshakable, how you no longer cling to their attention for validation. All of it becomes a mirror, reflecting back a version of themselves they may not be prepared to confront yet. And that's when the push-pull energy begins. Avoidants are experts at creating emotional tension, often unintentionally, because their internal struggle with intimacy is ongoing. When they feel drawn to someone again, their instinct pulls them closer, but the fear of being vulnerable pulls them back. It's a rhythm that can seem confusing and even frustrating to the person on the receiving end. They may approach, engaging in conversation or showing fleeting warmth, only to retreat moments later. But these fluctuations are not arbitrary. They reveal a deep internal conflict. Their heart and mind are caught in a delicate balance, both drawn to the connection and hesitant to fully embrace it. You might notice subtle signs, lingering glances that last just a heartbeat too long, pauses in conversation where they seem to be carefully considering what they want to reveal, or an unintentional mirroring of your movements and expressions. These small behaviors are not random. They are windows into the emotional storm quietly brewing within them. Despite the careful control they exhibit externally, internally they are processing feelings they thought were long gone. Their mind replays memories, their heart weighs possibilities, and their instincts begin evaluating the next move with precision. At the same time, a quiet fear often surfaces. This fear is different from the fear of intimacy that has guided their behavior in the past. It's a fear that they might have lost something real and irreplaceable. Seeing you again after no contact awakens this awareness because it forces them to measure what they have in comparison to what they might never get back. And fear in this context is not overwhelming panic. It's a focused, precise recognition of value. They may feel it as a sudden weight pressing against the edges of their composure, an undercurrent beneath every word they speak or every glance they cast in your direction. Even if they do not admit it, this fear drives many of their next actions. This is also the point when reflection becomes powerful. Avoidants start thinking about their past decisions, the times they withdrew, the opportunities they avoided, and the emotional moments they left unresolved. No contact gave you space to heal, but it also gave them the unexpected gift of time to reflect. Memories that were previously suppressed begin resurfacing, not as regrets they fully articulate, but as quiet questions that tug at their thoughts. Could they have handled things differently? Did they underestimate the connection? Are there opportunities to bridge the gap now before it's too late? These reflections often remain internal, but they subtly shape the way they approach the reconnection. And finally, there is the truth of what they feel when they see you again. Behind the guarded expressions, the neutral words, the occasional retreat, there is a mixture of nostalgia, curiosity, and the quiet recognition of your growth. They may never say it outright, may never directly verbalize the intensity of what they feel, but it's there. They see a version of you they didn't expect, someone who has evolved, someone who has reclaimed their emotional strength, someone who is no longer defined by the patterns of the past. This realization can trigger a complex blend of emotions: admiration, longing, respect, and even the faint stirring of vulnerability they thought they had fully controlled. All of these internal movements, the curiosity, the subtle fear, the reflections, the respect, and the longing, culminate in a pivotal moment. The way you respond, the energy you carry, and the calm independence you project can either open a new chapter or reinforce the distance that once defined the relationship. Avoidants notice everything: the small cues, the pauses, the silences. They measure emotional responses with acute sensitivity. Your self-assured presence has the power to shift the internal narrative they've held onto for months, and often it's in that shift where change begins to happen. This moment is transformational not just for them, but also for you. You are no longer the person who waits or chases. You are someone who creates boundaries, who has healed, who has claimed their own space and emotional agency. That alone is powerful, and it does more to influence an avoidant than any direct confrontation or emotional plea could. Your absence created a vacuum, and now your presence is creating a new equation, one in which they must reconsider not just their past actions, but also their future intentions. The power has subtly shifted, and they feel it almost immediately. And in that instant, something remarkable occurs. The avoidant, who once relied on distance to maintain emotional control, begins recognizing that the connection is not as simple as leaving it behind. It lingers, it persists, and it stirs curiosity and internal conflict. They are forced to navigate feelings they tried to suppress, confront the nuances of what you represented to them, and evaluate whether the emotional opportunity they once disregarded still exists. It's a silent, invisible process, but it is potent, and it happens instantly the moment your eyes meet, the moment your energy fills the room, and the moment your presence reminds them of what they once had and what they might still desire. So the next time you see someone avoidant after a period of no contact, remember this: they may not say everything they feel, and their actions may appear inconsistent, but inside, their mind is racing. Memories, reflections, curiosity, fear, and longing all swirl together in a delicate, precise storm, and that storm is responding directly to you. Your calmness, your growth, your independence, your presence. You are no longer merely a part of their past. You are a living reminder of the emotional depth they once encountered and the possibilities that still exist. And that, more than anything, is what they feel instantly when they see you again after no contact. This is the silent, powerful truth of avoidance. They may never fully articulate it, but the moment you appear again, everything changes, internally, instinctively, emotionally, and even if it doesn't show outwardly, the impact of that encounter lingers in their mind long after you leave. The connection, the reflection, the quiet realization of what was lost, and the subtle curiosity of what could be next, these are the invisible currents that flow through them the instant they see you again. It is emotional, it is instinctive, and it is undeniable.